This is a special episode of the STEMCELL Podcast, ISSCR 2024, Day 4. Hello, everybody. We are Doctors Daylon, James, and Arun Sharma. Welcome back to the STEMCELL Podcast, where we culture knowledge and stem cell research by talking to some of the brightest minds in the field. And that's what we've been doing for the last 4 days. Today, we're back with our final episode from the ISSCR 2024 annual meeting, which has taken place in Hamburg. We'll be discussing highlights from day 4, at least the morning of day 4 of the meeting, and we'll be sharing our thoughts on how it all went. If you're tuning in for the first time, be sure to visit www.stemcellpodcast.com or your favorite podcast app to check out our episodes covering the 3 previous days of the meeting. We're going to kick things off in just a minute, but before we get there,
Do you want to enhance your HPSC-derived research by being able to reproducibly generate 40-plus cell types and organoids with easy-to-follow protocols? Explore STEMCELL Technologies' collection of STEMDiff kits by browsing through the Interactive Product Explorer at www.stemdiff.com. Before we dive into today's session, day 4, we wanted to just chat a little bit about last evening. Had a wonderful, wonderful live show with Davide Marota and Dr. Kat Jameson on the topic of stem cell research in space. It was an amazingly well attended show, our best attended live show to date, with over 200 folks coming in and listening to what we had to say about stem cell research in space. It was a really insightful conversation that we had with Kat and Davide about the advantages of doing research in space. And as somebody who does this sort of work as well, it was cool to see them reflect on how mechanobiology is completely altered in a microgravity environment and how that leads to accelerated proliferation in a cancer context, especially what Kat is talking about, improved potentially organoid formation, and how there's just a lot of exciting unknowns to address in this particular field. Davide was also talking about how his team at the ISS, International Space Station National Laboratory, is enabling the research that scientists like Kat are doing on the space station by providing the resources, the funding, the portfolio, the connections to make this all happen. And one of the big takeaways that not only just from last night, but just from being in this field, that I take away from working here in this field is this is the most collaborative science that I've ever done, and that we get to do as space biologists, because it's impossible to do this sort of work on your own. You have to work together with what's called implementation partners, the folks who are able to make and take the science and customize it and put it into the right box to actually take it to the space station. You got to work with the aerospace engineers, the rocket folks, SpaceX, all this, NASA. It's a very, very complex team of folks that you have to work with, but ultimately, some of the most gratifying experiments that you can ever do as a biologist, because once you put your cells on that rocket, watch it take off, you know that it's a a lot of work that's led to this single moment. And Kat was able to share some of her journeys. I mean, she's had 7 to 8 flights, 6 to 7 flights going to the ISS on looking at cancer initiation in space. So really insightful session and really great audience engagement as well. A lot of folks are interested on the evolution of the space industry and how it intersects with biology. Traditionally, it was a government-driven enterprise, but now with the advent of private space stations such as the Axiom space station and others like that, there's more opportunities than ever for people to not just do research in space, but also potentially go to space themselves as maybe scientists, astronauts one day.
yeah, I saw a lot of hands go up when you asked how many people were there because secretly they wanted to go to space. Not so secretly, as it turns out. And that show, a live show is also always a lot of fun, and this one in particular was a little scary at first, but really gratifying to be among the presenters, which you've done like 4 or 5 times now at the ISSCR, old pro. But it was my first time presenting in front of an audience like that at the ISSCR. So great experience for me. And it didn't stop there. The conversations went on to the Wunderbar, where, the German party's legend and the German party in Germany, of course, as you would expect. No 10 p.m. and endpoints here. Fortuitously, came back to the hotel and ran into Jose Polo, friend of the show, who was at the bar with Hannah McCullough. We had a really, I mean, this is the best thing about this meeting. Hannah was there, like wrapping up an NIH grant, like after midnight, which she had to get into her program director. And I was just checking into a hotel because, that's a long story. But run into Jose, talking to McCullough. We're having a heated conversation about the importance of fetal tissue research. I mean, how geeky people around us were upset, maybe, but we were so into it, and it's what the meeting's all about: talking to like-minded people who have the same passions, even if you disagree. And we didn't disagree in this place, but made it even better. And then I ended up talking to Jose till like 1:30, hearing his whole journey, which was so fascinating. Gotta have him back on. So, I mean, this is like the moments outside the meeting, um, but in the meeting week that I think really make the ISSCR worth going to. And that's not to mention the talks, which we can roll into today. The concurrence this morning were excellent. I was busy bee again because I just wanted to get in as much of my favorites as I could before I had to go. I mean, that's the other thing. I was looking at the program, so many great talks. It started today with Lisa Laurenti from Cambridge, who was sharing her work on like single cell resolution of hematopoietic stem cell reconstitution with the real, as you would expect, high resolution view of growth kinetics, phenotyping, transcriptomic changes, showing that, maybe not surprising, the biggest loss, but important to show the kinetics, the biggest loss of potential and the mobilization and differentiation happens in the first 24 hours. And really excitingly here in this case, showing that ruxolitinib improved long-term transplant capacity by 3x and works by, as you would expect, shifting the balance of stat activity, this JAK stat inhibitor. But like this is the thing that's so great about this meeting. You come here, you get an idea that would relate to your own research. I'm thinking of working in an unrelated mechanism using that same compound in the context of treating infertility and fertile protection. So it's a little seed planted there. Then it was on to Jianping Fu from University of Michigan, who presented his neural tube model, which was published in Nature in April. So I don't want to go in depth on it, but it was really just beautiful to see the presentation. You read the paper and then you see the talk and all the movies and the thinking behind all the experiments. Long story short, it's like the consolidation of micropatterning and microfluidics and the chip tech that we talk about more and more, and which is becoming so pervasive, to establish these morphogen gradients and beautiful patterning across rostral, dorsal-ventral axes. I mean, pretty much making the neural tube in a dish with high fidelity. Then it was on. I caught because I thought this was important to get a little bit of this at least. I didn't see the whole thing, but I saw enough of the functional potential and moral status of human embryo model. So it was like a kind of side session. I caught Sandy Starr from the UK talking about regulatory bodies that met to form a coherent opinion in the UK about stem cell based embryo models, and just a few, not all of the some may be obvious, but I think important to make clear ideas there that all these models should be subject to oversight. They should be done for the minimum duration necessary to achieve the objective. And I thought I was thinking about that. And I think that's the thing about science that's both great, but can be kind of pernicious in this case, is that sometimes you're like, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. The experiments are good. Let's see what happens. And in this case, that could violate, I think, some standards that we would all agree on. Also, to provide details regarding a defined terminal step, so you know how you're gonna end these experiments, so to speak. Not to endow them with any kind of like life or anything, but I just think it's important to make clear how these things begin, how you're gonna do them, and of course how they end. You gotta cover your bases. And but just another one little thing amongst them, agreeing to have the project listed in a registry. Then there were the prohibitions. I thought there was some pretty obvious. You're not going to transfer a human or non-human embryo model into a human host. I mean, who's volunteering for that? But of course, um, no transfer of any human stem cell based model into any kind of uterus, which I think makes sense. And then, I mean, I wanted to laugh, but then, of course, the questions really brought out there was no ectogenesis, right? We're not going to do ectogenesis under any circumstances, which is like the island, except, actually the whole thing, Brave New World, more like. But then someone got up, and this is why these sessions are so great, and was like, but like, what about all of us who were like really rooting for ectogenesis, would love ectogenesis because we can't, carry a pregnancy. Um, and it brought out the important point that whether or not these things are scientifically feasible right now, notwithstanding Jacob Hanna's amazing efforts toward that, and whether or not it's scientifically feasible, it's important to have a ethical roadmap so that we know where we're going to go when the time comes. And then finally, I went over to hear Ron Weiss talk about these programmable organoids, which was really cool. He has his roots as a computer scientist turned biologist, and that was really clear um, in these kind of inducible systems, but more circuits. He called uh, perceptrons, he calls them, and by combining them, incorporating uh, a bunch of computational energy and making these really refined circuits, you can get the computational model and translate it into like an actual real biological experiment with high degrees of control. And the applications are not really realized yet, but the potential is high. And he showed with the, pretty not rudimentary, super intricate, but with like more straightforward demonstrative methods that the potential's there, and they have a really fine band of control that approximates the complexity of biology, but also underscores how complex the biological circuits we take for granted are, and how hard it is to exert control over self fate in like this dynamic environment of differentiation. We think, oh, overexpress this, overexpress that, but that really is oversimplifying. Because these circuits have been tuned over eons. And that was it for me for the concurrence. Arun, what were you doing?
I was staying pretty clinical. I mean, the ISSCR, I think, recently has had a tendency to shift a lot of the clinical sessions to the tail end of the meeting, perhaps in an effort to get people to stick around. And I think it's working. I mean, it's saved a lot of really high impact stuff for the last day. So I was in the updates on clinical trials concurrent session. I missed Vivian Tavar's talk, from Blue Rock and from your neck of the woods up there. But I went to Lisa Ott de Bruin's talk from Leiden. She was talking about a lentiviral gene therapy for RAG1 SCID for restoration of T cells in patients with different mutations and of SCID, RAG1 SCID. This is pretty cool. It's a ex vivo modification of CD34 positive cells, and then these cells are infused back. And ultimately, there's a gradual and actually pretty full T cell reconstitution as well as B cell reconstitution as well. And the thing that really touched me and as a parent is that these are really young kids, about 3 months of age, that are receiving this therapy, and ultimately they can have a semi-normal immune function down the road. There's a stable engraftment, and like I said, the most important thing is that these kids are doing pretty well clinically. Really cool to see. Then, a familiar face, Hideyuki Okano from Keio University in Japan, talking about his first in human clinical trial of transplantation of iPS-derived neurospheres and neural stem cells in a subacute spinal cord injury model. And we talked about spinal cord injury as one of the initial applications for stem cell technology. Going way back to the Jaron trial and so on. But this is, a much more advanced approach for treating spinal cord injury. And there's showing a lot of preclinical work here to support this this system in mouse and marmoset models as well. talked about the production of GMP grade and clinical grade iPSCs and the subsequent differentiation of the neural stem cells, which is actually limited to 4 passages, which I think is a good idea. There's no signs of tumorigenicity here. And this is, again, an early phase study. 2 million cells are transplanted in spinal cord after 14 to 20 days after injury. So it is a bit of a heterogeneous population in terms of the patients that are getting this. First patient was actually in 2021, and they're still compiling their full data set, but they're aiming that by the end of 2024 they're going to have they're going to be able to complete the follow-up for all cases. The data is coming, and as you might expect with anything IPS related in Japan, the one and only Shinya Yamanaka also had a heavy involvement in this particular study. Moving on to Sonia Schrepfer, who does some really, really amazing work, if you're not aware by now, on hypoimmune islet cells. She's, of course, at UCSF, associated with Sana Biotherapeutics as well. So these hypoimmune islet cells and hypoimmune cells in general, um, without immunosuppression, being able to transplant them allogeneically into the body using this immune masking technology that they've fleshed out in their labs. Her slides crashed in the very beginning, which is kind of a bummer, but she did an awesome job giving a impromptu speech for her background presentation. And ultimately, when the slides came back up, she was able to give a great recap on how they're using this immune shielding, how it can work across all different cell types that they've tested, blocking both adaptive and the innate immune system, preventing rejection, right, of the graft. So this hypoimmune platform can create this regenerative pipeline for allogeneic CAR T therapies. And it works by basically you knock out the MHC1 and 2 and TCR alpha complexes and add in this CD47 signal as well to help with the survival. In the CAR T side of things, the patient T cells will kill the wild type, but the CAR T cells do not kill the double knockout T cells or the hypoimmune. So the hypoimmune, cells are able to survive long term, which is great. There's no detectable immune response in the patient towards these hypoimmune CAR T cells, which is what you want. And then the second part of it, and I think she's talked about a lot of this before, is this non-human primate application in the realm of diabetes, right? So you got these hypoimmune islets, pancreatic islets, right, that can survive 10 plus months in a non-human primate model without immunosuppression. It's an incredible data of immune shielding and evasion in an allogeneic model, once again. And I think we talked about this again previously on the show, but she's, for those of you who haven't heard about this before, has this really cool N of one monkey study where this N of one type 1 diabetes model was received these hypoimmune pancreatic islet cells. These are primary, not iPS derived, and there's a great survival for these cells 6 months post transplantation. It was actually injected in the muscle, not in the pancreas itself, but regardless, without immunosuppression, there was long-term survival of this islet graft. So that was actually published in Cell Stem Cell, and I think again we did cover it on the paper a while back, but she wanted to let us know that the human version of this is also progressing in Sweden in particular. So staying clinical, plenary number 6, as I alluded to, is titled "The Clinical Reality and Promise of Cell and Gene Therapies." Starting off with one of my favorite, clinical therapies, applied therapies for pluripotent stem cells, presented by Catherine Priest from Neurona Therapeutics. She's presented this data before, but I really love looking at this because it's such a dramatic effect on a really debilitating disease and epilepsy. So, recapping the phase 1/2 clinical trial of this NRTX 1001 inhibitory interneuron cell therapy for drug refractory focal epilepsy. This is an embryonic stem cell derived GMP GABAergic interneuron therapy, really highly pure, treating, like I said, temporal lobe epilepsy as the first indication. But one of the new things that she alluded to towards the end is they're going to shift this. The FDA has actually approved the broadening of the indication to other epilepsies as well, in part because of how amazing this the impact of this therapy has been. So the cell therapy deliveries to the epicampus is really quite dramatic. You have, in N of 10 patients, you have 75 median reduction in seizures in 6+ months for 5 people. And there's actually 2 patients who had 95% overall seizure reduction. That's an amazing statistic after 6 months. They're stable after removal from the immunosuppression. And the other important thing to allude to is the new data from this particular trial is going to come in winter of 2024. So stay tuned for that. And I've got a feeling that Hong Kong, we're going to have a lot of brand new clinical trial data. So that's really exciting. One other, a couple other things that I thought were really cool before we had to run. One was this new approach to salivary gland organoids to treating radiotherapy induced xenostomia, which is something you might not think about after cancer therapy, where after the radiation therapy, you lose function in your salivary glands. And this can really severely impact your quality of life, your there's a lot of dental side effects there. So here they've been making salivary gland organoids, and this is the team of Robert Kops from the Groningen in Netherlands. They've made salivary gland organoids from both mice and from human. They look like a bunch of grapes, in his words. They had a mouse transplantation model where the organoids can actually attenuate hyposalivation, so the mice are able to drool a bit more, which is great. And then they progress this to the human system as well. And again, the goal is to restore salivation, salivary gland function in human patients after chemotherapy. So they started this phase 1/2 clinical trial with cancer patients who received radiotherapy, autologous salivary gland organoid transplantation, and he showed some data from a 42-year-old patient with squamous cell carcinoma, and his glands were stable after a year, and actually some restoration of the saliva production, which is great. And the last thing second to last thing that I was able to catch was the in vivo direct reprogramming of tumor cells to dendritic cells as a new cancer immunotherapy from Christiana Priest over at ISSCR Therapeutics in Sweden. This is all preclinical data, but that's nicely setting up their clinical trial there of this adenovirus delivering a reprogramming factor in vivo to tumor cells to actually basically reprogram the tumor to almost attack itself. It's an off the shelf product where they're reprogramming dendritic cells to drive anti tumor immunity. As you might expect, it actually has this nice synergistic effect with existing immune checkpoint inhibitors, and it's pretty efficient in vivo reprogramming of cancer cells in various in vivo models, and they're progressing it to the clinic. And the final thing that we were able to catch before we have to head out here actually was a really powerful patient advocacy talk, and we often have these every single year at ISSCR. This was Michael Ryberg, and he's an individual, a man from Sweden who has Parkinson's disease. And it was a really powerful chat with the session moderator, Dr. Roger Barker, about Mr. Rydberg's journey with Parkinson's, how his family has been able to support him, how he's tried his best to maintain a semi-normal quality of life over his many years of being afflicted with Parkinson's, and how he's been able to tolerate a cell therapy that he received. So, really powerful thing, very powerful presentation to end on here.
That was a great note to end on for me because it really brought home the human element. I'm not gonna lie, I was crying a little bit just with the courage of Michael to get up there with his dyskinesia and to speak, although he was, as Roger described, remarkably phlegmatic. But also just, you could see his strength, but you could see the challenge he faced. And it's odd, as invested as we are as scientists in that or any other degenerative disease, we don't really see them as often as we should. So I think it's a really nice note for us to end on. I'm glad the ISSCR has incorporated that patient advocate element into each meeting each year. And yeah, I'm afraid that's it. We're gonna miss the award session, but we caught a few award winners on the side. I saw Junwoo just today and congratulated him at a short talk about his journeys over the last few and future weeks. And we ran into and had coffee with Sergio yesterday. So we're covering a lot of the bases here, and that's what the meeting's all about. I think that's the outcome you want to reconnect with former guests on the show, to talk about the science, of course, to hear about everything new, and most of all, I would say for me, and I'm sure I speak for Arun as well, to finally get to meet a lot of the listeners, often for the second or third time at the second or third meeting, and to interact with you with the delegate sessions or the live show. I mean, everything about it. It's been busy, but it's really been a great few days. I feel very lucky to have this platform to share our love of science with you guys. And that brings us to the end of our ISSCR 2024 episode series. We've met a lot of people and had a lot of fun. We already can't wait to the 2025 meeting in Hong Kong. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at www.stemcellpodcast.com. You can also reach out to us on X at STEMCELL or by email at info@stemcellpodcast.com with feedback. See you next time, guys. We'll be back on our regular schedule, including that delegate episode pretty shortly. So stay tuned. Arun, any parting words for the guys out there?
Oh, thanks so much for the love, and we'll see you in Hong Kong.